They bit. They screamed. They drove every nanny away. So why did the twins suddenly cling to the maid, who refused to leave? Winter pressed in on the Ashcombe estate, the kind of cold that settled into walls and never quite left. Inside, the house felt just as frozen. Briar and Elwyn Ashcombe were only 3 years old, but already known for what they did to anyone who tried to care for them. They screamed until voices cracked. They pulled hair. They bit during diaper changes. They threw toys hard enough to leave marks. 11 nannies had come and gone in 14 months. Each one left shaking her head, whispering the same thing. Something is wrong with those girls. Their father, Harlan Ashcombe, stopped going into the nursery altogether. It was easier to sign checks than to face children he no longer understood. Their mother disappeared from their world overnight. No goodbye. No explanation. No gentle transition. Just gone. So when a poor maid named Danielle Booker arrived to clean the house, no one warned her about the twins. They assumed she wouldn't last the week. What no one expected was that fear had finally met someone who didn't run from it. Before we continue, please like, share, and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's dive back into the story. The gates of Ashcombe groaned open, their hinges creaking like old secrets being disturbed. Snow blanketed the grounds in a suffocating silence, muffling every sound except the occasional, eerie echo of something crashing within the grand estate. Inside, the once proud halls stood hushed, but not peaceful. 11 nannies in 14 months, that was the unspoken record. Some left in tears, others in silence. A few in ambulances. The staff had stopped learning names. They barely learned faces before those faces vanished down the stone steps forever. The latest had left her scarf behind, still hanging on the coat rack like a white flag of surrender. Upstairs, 2 little girls stood in their nursery mirrors of each other, Briar and Elwyn. Matching black palm hats, purple fleece jackets now covered in tiny fingerprints of cookie crumbs and dried paint. They didn't speak. They screamed. They didn't cry. They bit. They didn't run to anyone. They only ran from. Toys were scattered like landmines, and the walls bore the artwork of war, crayon scratches, torn wallpaper, and the faint stain of juice hurled in rage. One nanny had made the mistake of sitting too close. A Lego thrown hard enough had drawn blood. "Unmanageable," whispered the butler to the housekeeper one morning. The word slipped out like a curse. They didn't know the twins had been listening behind the door. Briar clung to Elwyn like a lifeline. Elwyn clutched her sister tighter. No one else could touch them. No one was allowed in. Harlan watched them from the hall sometimes, always at a distance, always silent. A man with power carved into his jawline and grief hiding behind his eyes. He never corrected the staff, never intervened. He simply watched, as if hoping someone else might succeed where all had failed. The girls never asked for their mother. They didn't speak her name, but her absence rang louder than her presence ever had. Her scent lingered on the pillows, her piano, untouched, her laughter vanished, but her absence still haunted like footsteps on the stairs. The house had grown colder without her. The fire in the hearth was kept burning, but it never felt warm. Not really. Sometimes at night, the twins would scream in their sleep, tangled in each other's arms, and no one would come. No one dared. Fear lived in the walls now, older than any new hire, thicker than the frost that crusted the windows each dawn. They weren't just misbehaving children. They were children breaking, and still, no one could agree on what had caused it. The older staff blamed grief. The newer staff muttered about the things they heard, laughter turning to sobs, toys that moved, doors that locked themselves. Everyone had a theory, but no one had answers. Down the hall, the nursery door slammed shut again. Another toy broken. Another shout. The house seemed to sigh beneath the weight of the unknown, and Harlan stood just outside their door, unmoving, eyes closed, listening. Something in this house was wrong. Very wrong. But the only ones who knew what weren't saying a word. Fear often speaks before words ever learn how. Some children don't know how to ask for help. They only know how to push people away. If stories like this matter to you, don't look away too early. Something is clearly wrong, but no one agrees on what caused it. Danielle Booker arrived without fanfare. No formal welcome. No handshake. No tour. Just a folded uniform on a bench and a stack of linens waiting by the service door. She wasn't brought in like the others. No one called her a nanny. She didn't come with child psychology degrees or polished references. She was listed as cleaning staff assigned to rotate through the West Wing, avoid eye contact, and most importantly, do not engage with the twins. The head of staff had pulled her aside that morning, voice low, like she was whispering secrets to the walls. They'll scream, might throw things. Keep walking. Danny didn't ask questions. She nodded, took the uniform, started scrubbing. Her first shift was quiet. Until it wasn't. She stepped into the nursery hallway with a mop in hand and the faint sound of music playing from an old toy piano. Then, silence. Then, screaming. Two small voices, high-pitched and wild. The air cracked with the sound of a bowl hitting the floor and shattering. Footsteps ran. Another object, a juice cup this time, slammed against the baseboard near Danny's ankle, splattering her shoes. She didn't flinch. She bent down, picked up the shards, wiped the juice. The twins stood in the doorway, eyes wide, breaths heaving. They had done this before, and every time before, someone either yelled or left. Danny simply kept cleaning. They threw a second cup, missed. She cleaned that too. Still no reaction. By the end of the hour, she had scrubbed down the nursery windowsills, replaced a light bulb, and swept the corners where cookie crumbs lived like secrets. The twins watched her every move. Silent now, confused. When Danny stepped out, the door didn't slam shut behind her. The next day, it happened again. She came in with gloves and a spray bottle, a tray of folded towels in her arms. The twins were waiting this time, crouched behind a pile of blankets like tiny hunters in ambush. One flung a sock at her face. Danny didn't look up. She unfolded a towel and stacked it neatly. They circled her like shadows. No eye contact, no commands, no lectures, no discipline, just endurance. And that was the first crack in the pattern, because no one had ever stayed long enough to see the game change. By day 4, they stopped throwing things. Mostly, they started placing them, quietly, in her path, just to see. A puzzle piece, a teddy bear, a slipper left deliberately near the mop bucket. Testing, measuring, waiting for her to slip. She didn't. She folded. She wiped. She hummed under her breath, a sound so soft it barely existed. Not a lullaby, not a prayer, just presence, a quiet witness to their chaos. And though she never looked them in the eye, they began looking at her, studying, waiting, because if she wasn't going to leave, then surely she must be broken too. Sometimes the strongest walls are built not out of pride, but survival. It's easy to love children when they're sweet, but what about the ones who make it hardest? If that question stirs something in you, don't walk away now. They weren't done testing her, not even close. It started with a block, hard plastic, small, yellow, hurled fast enough to leave a welt if it connected. It missed Danny's shoulder by inches, clattering against the marble floor of the hallway. She didn't blink. The twins stood at the end of the corridor. Briar's little fists were already full of the next one. Elowen's face was flushed, her chin trembling not with anger but something else, something deeper. They charged together. Small bodies, fierce legs, bare feet pattering across polished floors. Tiny hands gripped Danny's apron. One yanked her hair hard enough to pull her backward. The other spat, not with malice, but desperation. They screamed again when she turned her face away. And still, Danny didn't react. She crouched low, slowly, letting her knees creak under her. She reached for the scattered laundry. She dropped pale linens now dusted with breadcrumbs and jelly fingerprints. She didn't speak. She simply kept folding. That was when they smeared yogurt across a freshly laundered shirt. Another test. A louder one. Briar's eyes watched her the whole time, waiting for the fury, waiting for the slam of a door or the snapping of a voice. But Danny didn't yell. She wiped the yogurt off with a damp cloth and kept folding. though her hands trembled just enough for Elowen to notice. The screaming started again when Donnie stood to leave. Not tantrum screams. Not angry ones. Raw, panicked. Like children caught in a wave, reaching for someone they didn't know how to ask to stay. Danny paused at the doorframe, her back still to them, and closed her eyes. She had heard this kind of scream before. Years ago. In a home that wasn't hers. In a bedroom where she had been called too difficult for crying too much. Too loud. Too sensitive. Her things had been packed in silence the next morning. She remembered watching through a cracked window as the social worker's car pulled up. Another home. Another hallway. Another Danny. Every move left her emptier. Quieter. Smaller. Until finally, no one packed anything anymore. They just left her behind. And now, decades later, she stood in another hallway, with two little girls whose screams weren't threats, they were pleas disguised in panic. She turned back. The girls had stopped screaming. They stared at her, chests heaving, tears clinging to their cheeks like glass. She didn't reach out. She didn't kneel. She just nodded. Once, slowly, the way you acknowledge someone else's pain without trying to fix it, and she walked away. Not fast. Not far, just enough to see if they'd follow. They didn't, not yet, but something had shifted. For the first time, Danny saw it clearly behind the hair-pulling, the biting, the wild chaos of emotion. They weren't violent, they were terrified of being replaced. Some wounds don't bleed, they cling. When kids act out, it's easy to call it bad behavior. But what if it's just their way of begging not to be left behind again? If you've ever felt unseen, keep reading. If fear looks like fury, what does love look like when no one trusts it? The snow fell harder that night. Ashcomb's windows pulsed with light, but the halls inside felt darker than usual. A hush had settled, not peaceful, but tense. Like a decision had been made and no one wanted to say it out loud. In the staff kitchen, Donnie dried her hands on a worn towel and reached for the teapot just as Margot, the house manager, stepped into the room. Sharp heels, sharper eyes. "You're making things worse," Margot said, quietly but without softness. Danny paused, the kettle in her hands. "They used to be wild," Margot continued, folding her arms. "Now they're attached. That's more dangerous. We can't afford dependency, not when it ends the same way every time." Danny didn't answer. "They scream when you leave. They don't sleep unless they know you're in the wing. That's not progress, Danielle. That's a liability." In the silence that followed, the heater groaned as it kicked on. Outside, snow piled against the windows, sealing the estate in a cocoon of cold. "She's just a cleaner," one of the maids whispered later, just loud enough for Danny to hear as she passed. "They'll fire her soon, or she'll quit like the rest." But Danny didn't quit. Not when she overheard Harlan's voice 2 rooms away, firm but fatigued. "If this continues," he told Margot, "we may need to remove them from the house. Temporarily." That, temporarily, a word that always sounded like a soft promise. Until it became permanent. Danny stood in the hallway, unseen. She heard every word, and still she showed up the next morning. Same uniform, same quiet walk, same mop and folded laundry over one arm. But now, staying came at a price. The twins were waiting at the nursery door. Briar leaned against the frame, chewing her thumb. Elowen sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes locked on the hallway. When Danny stepped into view, neither of them moved, but their chins lifted, their backs straightened. They didn't scream. They didn't throw anything. They just watched, as if checking to see if this would be the morning she didn't come back. And when she did, something small and unseen passed between them, a silent pact. Because while the adults in the house held whispered meetings behind doors, the girls had already chosen their side. It's easy to walk away from difficult children. Staying is harder. If you believe some stories deserve patience, stay with this one. The house had made its stance clear. Now every step Danny took came with risk, and the girls weren't the only ones watching. The front door flew open with a thunderclap of sound. 2 small figures darted out into the snow, coats flapping, boots barely zipped. Their screams pierced the quiet of the winter afternoon. sharp enough to startle the birds from the hedges. No one had time to stop them. Staff froze in the hallway. The door banged against the frame. And there they were, Briar and Elowen, racing into the biting cold, melting snow crunching beneath their feet, their hair wild with panic. One of them tripped. The other screamed harder. Inside, someone shouted, "Get Harlan!" But Danny was already walking out. She didn't run. She didn't raise her voice. She stepped down from the entryway, the snow soaking into the soles of her shoes. The cold cut through her uniform. But she didn't stop. The twins were near the bottom step now, tangled in each other, sobbing like something inside them had snapped. Danny didn't speak. She didn't command them back inside. She simply knelt, right there in the snow. Her knees hit the frozen ground with a quiet thud, and she stayed there still, steady, waiting. She said nothing. She didn't reach for them. She just made herself small enough to match their world. The wind caught her hair, blew it across her face, but she didn't move. Her eyes stayed soft, patient, not pleading, not proud, just present. Briar was the first to look up. Her lip trembled, her cheeks red with cold and fury. Then slowly, her small boots shuffled forward. One hesitant step, then another. She stood in front of Danny for a full breath, and then, without a word, she leaned in and kissed Danny's cheek. A second later, Elowen followed. 2 kisses, one on each side. Then silence. Danny closed her eyes. Her breath caught not from the cold, but from the weight of it. The surrender, the trust. Snowflakes landed on her lashes, melting as they touched her skin. Behind her, the door creaked again. Harlan stepped out, coat unbuttoned, his tie crooked like he'd come in a rush. He stopped halfway down the steps, his breath clouded in the air. His shoes crunched on the ice. But he didn't move closer. He didn't need to. He saw everything. The girls, the kneeling woman, the quiet that had replaced chaos. And in that breathless pause between heartbeats, he saw the truth that had eluded everyone for so long. The problem had never been the twins. Sometimes love doesn't arrive loudly, it kneels. The hardest children to reach are often the ones who needed someone the most. If this moment moved you, stay a little longer. Their story isn't finished. For the first time, someone had been chosen back, and nothing in the house would be the same again. The fire crackled, but the room still felt cold. Outside, wind scraped against the windows like fingernails. The storm hadn't fully arrived, but its shadow crept through the trees. Inside, the walls of Harlan's study, once imposing, now felt like they were leaning in. Danny stood at the threshold. She hadn't been invited in, not exactly. But when she passed by and saw the light on, something in her paused and stayed. Harlan sat behind the desk, hands clasped, shoulders stiff like they hadn't been allowed to fall in weeks. "You should know," he said, voice low. "About their mother." Danny didn't speak. "I didn't explain because... How do you explain something like that to children who still sleep with stuffed animals?" Silence settled, thick and waiting. "She collapsed," he said finally. "One morning, out of nowhere. Hallway outside their room. I carried her downstairs myself." He didn't look at Danny as he spoke. "They said it was neurological. Sudden, severe. She hasn't spoken since. Most days, she doesn't even look up. Just stares out a window that doesn't open." Danny stepped in, one quiet footfall, but still said nothing. "I didn't want them to see her like that. Thought I was protecting them." His voice cracked. "So I sent them away. The staff took them before she was even out of surgery. No goodbye, no warning. They were just gone." His hand trembled on the desk. "I thought I'd bring them back when she recovered, but she never did. And by then, they wouldn't let anyone near them." Danny's breath caught. Suddenly, all the chaos made sense. The biting, the screaming, the broken toys, the desperate eyes. Every time she turned to leave the room, they hadn't just lost their mother. They'd lost everything all at once, and no one had told them why. No last hug, no chance to hold on. Just silence. "I thought I was protecting them," Harlan whispered again. "But what I really did was disappear. His voice dropped, barely a breath. I watched them fall apart. And I let it happen. The admission hung in the room like smoke. Nanny moved closer now. Still quiet. Still without judgment. Because she knew that kind of silence, the kind that follows bad decisions made with good intentions. She sat in the chair across from him. Not as a critic, not even as staff. Just as someone who understood what it meant to be taken without warning. I used to think they were trying to hurt people, she said softly. But now I know they're trying to survive them. Harlan looked up finally and she saw it. The guilt. But underneath that, the shift. The beginning of responsibility. Because naming the truth had changed something. And it wasn't just grief anymore. It was the weight of choices made and the chance to make a new one. Some children don't need fixing. They need someone to stay long enough to understand them. If that truth matters to you, don't stop listening yet. The past had stolen their peace, but now someone knew how to give it back. It didn't happen all at once. There was no flash of light. No single day where everything changed. No breakthrough to post on a chart. Just a slow, steady shift that crept in so quietly. Most people missed it, but Nanny noticed. It began when the therapist arrived. She came without a clipboard. No coat. No bright, overcompensating smile. She didn't kneel and speak in sugary tones. She just sat quietly, calmly in the therapy room near the nursery, with a warm cup of tea and a lap full of soft toys, saying nothing at all for the first 10 minutes. The twins didn't approach her. Not at first. They sat, curled on the couch at the far end of the room, legs tangled together, eyes darting back and forth like they were ready to run. But Nanny was there. Not officially. She had no title in the sessions. No formal approval. But she was allowed in quietly, respectfully, and only because Briar and Elowen had clung to her sleeves the first time someone suggested she wait in the hall. So she stayed. Sometimes just folding blankets in the corner. Sometimes just sitting, back straight, hands still. A quiet presence. Like a candle that refused to flicker. By the second week, the girls stopped flinching when the therapist placed a toy near them. By the third, they started playing. Side by side. Not with her, but in her space. And for the first time since Nanny had arrived at Ashcombe, they didn't attack anyone. They still struggled. They still had bad mornings. Elowen sometimes refused to eat. Briar still had nightmares that pulled Nanny out of bed at 2 a.m. But they no longer screamed when left. They no longer threw shoes at the kitchen staff or locked themselves in closets. Their world, once jagged and loud, had started to soften. The house felt it too. Less creaking in the night. Fewer whispers about replacements. More warmth in the fireplaces, and not just from the heat. And then something even quieter happened. Harlan sat down. It was a Tuesday, late afternoon. Overcast skies. The therapy session had ended, but no one had left the room. The twins were building a tower of blocks, precarious and tilting. Nanny sat nearby, patching a torn stuffed bear. Harlan came to the doorway. For a long moment, he stood there, one foot in, one out. Then slowly, without speaking, he stepped inside and lowered himself onto the rug beside them. His knees cracked, his breath caught, his hands hovered, unsure. But he sat, and the girls didn't move away. They didn't leap into his arms or call him Daddy like the stories like to imagine. They just kept stacking blocks, but they did it closer now, within reach, within choice. That evening, no one said a word about it. But Nanny noticed the bear she had mended ended up in Harlan's lap the next morning. And that night, the twins didn't ask her to stay in the hallway after bedtime. They just whispered, "Good night," and fell asleep. Healing doesn't rush. It waits until fear feels safe enough to leave. Not all miracles come with trumpets. Some come disguised as soft routines, quiet rooms, and people who never stop showing up. If you're still here, maybe it's because you understand the slow kind of love, and the story's not over yet. Love didn't kick the door in. It sat quietly until it was allowed inside. But the house hadn't forgotten its shadows, and one was about to return. Snow fell like a whisper that evening. Not the angry kind that howled through trees or buried roads in fury. This was softer. Like the world itself had exhaled. like something that had been clenched for too long was finally, gently, letting go. The estate grounds stretched quiet under a sky tinged with lavender. The garden walls, once lined with brittle branches, now sparkled with frost like a second chance, and in the middle of it all, two small figures moved slowly across the snow. Briar and Elowen, bundled in coats too big for their frames, boots clumsily mismatched, mittens full of melting snow. They weren't shrieking. They weren't running wild. They weren't hiding. They were playing, quietly. Briar packed a snowball with slow, serious concentration. Elowen built a crooked snow fort, stopping every so often to glance toward the house, as if checking that someone was still watching. And someone was. Danny stood on the porch. No fanfare, no applause, no camera flash to capture the arc of her presence. Just her, hands tucked into her sleeves, scarf wrapped twice, breath rising in the cold. She didn't call out, didn't wave. She just stood present like she had been all along, watching, waiting, honoring their space without ever leaving it. And Harlan saw it too. From the study window, one hand resting on the glass, he watched the woman he had almost dismissed, the one who had never been meant to stay, do the one thing no wealth, no title, no carefully screened nanny had ever managed. She had waited. And the waiting, not the fixing, had changed everything. The therapist still came, once a week. The girls still had hard nights. Sometimes Briar wouldn't speak for hours. Sometimes Elowen still stood outside closed doors like she expected someone to vanish behind them. Celia's room remained untouched, the same white orchid wilting beside the window. Her prognosis hadn't changed. No miracle had reversed her silence. But in the spaces she left behind, something else had grown. Not perfection, but peace. No one spoke of it like a victory. Not even Harlan. Especially not Harlan. Because now he understood what he hadn't before. Wealth had kept the house standing. But it was patience that kept his daughters from falling. And Danny, never formally hired to do anything more than clean, had offered that patience without being asked. There would be no portrait of her on the staircase. No record of her in the family's official files. But out in the snow, when Briar threw a snowball too hard and Elowen laughed, it was Danny they ran toward. Not for praise, not for help, but just to know she'd seen them. To know someone still stayed. And that was everything. Not every miracle changes the world. Some only change who a child learns to trust. Some stories don't end with applause, they end with understanding. If stories like this remind you why compassion still matters, staying connected is how they live on. The world didn't shift. The sky didn't open. But in the hush of winter's end, two children finally played without fear, and someone stayed to see it.